You already know something is wrong. You have known for a while now. Not wrong with the world, not wrong with people around you, wrong with you. The version of you that shows up every day is not the version you see when you close your eyes at night. And the distance between those two men, the one you are and the one you know you should be, that distance is not growing smaller, it is growing. And deep down, in the place you do not talk about, you already know exactly why. Machiavelli knew it too. He watched it happen to kings, to generals, and to every category of powerful man history has ever produced. Niccolo Machiavelli spent his life inside the machinery of real power. Not the performed version of power that most people spend their lives chasing, the titles, the status, the visible markers that signal arrival to people who never quite arrive. He studied the raw, cold mechanics of how men actually rise, hold ground, and how they fall. And the pattern he documented across rulers, generals, and princes was not what most men expect when they first encounter his work. The pattern was not that great men were destroyed by great enemies. Great men were destroyed by themselves, by specific, identifiable, psychological failures operating inside them long before any external force got close enough to finish the job. Ask yourself honestly, and this is the first question this video is going to ask you that I want you to answer in the comments below. When was the last time you operated at the full capacity you know you actually possess? Not a good day. Not a single motivated morning. The last time you were genuinely, consistently, dangerously focused for a sustained and uninterrupted period of time. Most men who hear that question cannot honestly answer it. And that silence, that inability to point to a specific, recent, sustained period of genuine, focused output is the single most important data point in their lives, and the one they work hardest to avoid examining. The first mechanism Machiavelli identified, and the one modern neuroscience has since confirmed with a precision that should make every serious man deeply uncomfortable, is this. Your brain is not your ally, not by default, not in the environment you are currently living inside. The human brain evolved for a world that no longer exists, which means the cognitive defaults it runs on were designed to solve problems you are no longer facing, and they consistently fail to solve the problems you actually are. The prefrontal cortex, the region responsible for long-term planning, strategic thinking, and impulse control, is metabolically expensive. It consumes significant energy to operate. Your brain, which evolved to conserve resources, defaults away from it constantly. Every notification on your phone, every algorithmically engineered piece of content, every social comparison trigger you encounter is a deliberate signal designed by engineers who understand your neurology better than you do, and every single one of those signals pulls you further from strategic thinking and deeper into reactive, emotional, impulsive behavior. You are not distracted because you lack discipline. You are distracted because you are inside a system specifically built to make distraction your neurological default. The question is whether you understand the system well enough to override it, or whether you have been running on its settings your entire life without realizing it was never programmed in your interest. Machiavelli called men who could not govern their own responses permanently vulnerable, not occasionally, permanently. Because reactivity is not a bad day, it is a pattern. And patterns, reinforced through daily repetition, become the operating architecture of the mind that runs them. Here is what actually happens inside your brain in the moment of provocation, and I want you to pay close attention because this is the mechanism that has quietly sabotaged more men than any external opposition ever managed. A stimulus arrives, an insult, a setback, a challenge, an unexpected obstacle. Within milliseconds before your conscious mind has fully processed what is happening, your amygdala fires. Cortisol and adrenaline flood your bloodstream. Your heart rate climbs. Blood flow is redirected away from your prefrontal cortex and toward your motor systems. Your body is already preparing a physical response before a single rational thought has cleared the gate. This is what researchers call the amygdala hijack. The emotional brain seizes control of behavioral output before the rational brain has been consulted. And in most men, by the time rational thought arrives, the damage is already in motion. The The response has already been delivered, the information has already been broadcast. The position has already been weakened, and the sophisticated observer who was watching for exactly that moment has already filed every piece of intelligence they needed. Now, here is what Machiavelli understood, that most modern men still do not. The problem is not that you have emotional responses. Every human being has them. The problem is that you have not built the psychological infrastructure to create a deliberate pause between the stimulus and your response. A gap inside which your prefrontal cortex can reassert governance before the limbic system has already acted on your behalf. That gap does not exist naturally in most men. It has to be constructed, it has to be practiced. And every time you successfully insert it, every time you feel the emotional pull toward immediate reaction and choose deliberate assessment instead, you are physically rewiring your neural pathways through the mechanism of neuroplasticity. The connection between stimulus and impulsive response weakens through disuse. The connection between stimulus and calculated assessment strengthens through repetition. Over time, the man who consistently practices this does not become a man who suppresses his reactions through exhausting willpower. He becomes a man whose brain has been structurally rebuilt to default toward calculation. That is not self-control in the motivational sense, that is applied neuroscience. And Machiavelli described its behavioral outcomes with perfect accuracy 4 centuries before the biology was mapped. The second principle Machiavelli embedded throughout his writing is one that modern behavioral psychology has since documented under a framework called social norm internalization, and it explains something about your life that you have probably felt but never been able to name precisely. The people around you are not just influencing your decisions. They are setting the neurological parameters of what your brain considers possible. Human beings evolved in small tribal groups, where alignment with the group's behavioral norms was directly tied to survival. The neural circuitry that once governed tribal conformity now governs your professional ambition, your standards, your tolerance for mediocrity, and your sense of how far you're allowed to reach. And it does this automatically, below the threshold of conscious awareness, without your permission and without announcing itself. When you are consistently surrounded by people operating at a particular level of thinking, your brain's social calibration systems begin treating that level as the norm, and deviation above the norm, raising your standards, expanding your vision, operating at a level that visibly exceeds those around you, produces genuine neurological discomfort. The same social pain signals that once preceded tribal exclusion. Your own brain generates resistance to your own growth, because growth, in the social context you are embedded in, registers as a threat to group belonging. This is what Machiavelli meant when he wrote that a prince, surrounded by weak counsel, would eventually think weakly, regardless of how strong his original vision was. He was describing social norm internalization centuries before the research existed to name it. Your environment is not a backdrop. It is an active, continuous, unsolicited programming force operating on your cognition every single day. The documented research on this phenomenon is extensive and genuinely disturbing for any man willing to read it clearly. Studies on peer influence and performance consistently demonstrate that individuals calibrate their effort, their output, and their ambition to match the observable standard of their immediate social group, even when they consciously believe they are operating independently. The calibration happens automatically. It happens without permission. And it produces a ceiling that feels completely internal. Feels like the natural limit of the individual's own capacity when it is in fact an externally imposed constraint generated entirely by social proximity. You are not failing to reach your potential. You are reaching the potential that your environment has assigned to you, and you are calling that assignment your own. Here is the question I want you to sit with, the one I want you to answer honestly in the comments, not for me, but for yourself. Look at the 5 people you spend the most time with. What is the ceiling of their ambition? What is the standard of their daily discipline? What do they consider acceptable in terms of effort, focus, and the refusal to settle? Because that ceiling, those standards, that definition of acceptable, they are already inside you right now, operating on your thinking, whether you have noticed them or not. The third principle concerns information specifically, the catastrophic strategic cost of revealing too much of it. In any competitive environment, information functions as the primary currency of power. The person with the most accurate intelligence about the other party's intentions, vulnerabilities, emotional states, and planned movements holds a decisive and compounding advantage in every exchange. This is not a philosophical observation. It is the operational foundation of every serious competitive strategy in history, from military doctrine to negotiation theory to behavioral economics. What most men consistently fail to apply is the inverse. If information about your opponent gives you power over them, then information about you, your plans, your insecurities, your emotional reactions, your next intended move gives them equivalent power over you. Every word you speak unnecessarily is a strategic withdrawal. Every plan you announce before execution is intelligence handed freely to anyone positioned to interfere with it. Every emotion you display publicly is a detailed map of your psychological vulnerabilities delivered directly to every sophisticated mind observing the exchange. Machiavelli documented this pattern with devastating consistency. The rulers who fell earliest and most completely were almost always the ones who spoke too much, revealed too soon, and allowed their emotional states to be read too easily by those around them. He watched kingdoms collapse not because the enemy was more powerful, but because the prince had handed the enemy a complete intelligence portrait of his own weaknesses through unguarded speech and unmanaged emotional display. The psychological research on information disclosure and perceived authority is equally unambiguous. Individuals who disclose less in competitive social situations are consistently perceived as higher status, more authoritative, and more powerful, not because of what they said, but because of what they deliberately chose not to say. The mechanism is status signaling. High-status individuals in social hierarchies do not need to explain their decisions, justify their positions, or announce their intentions in advance to lower-status members. The behavior of selective concealment therefore registers automatically in the observing mind as a signal of genuine power rather than performed confidence. Your brain reads it before you consciously process it. And in a world where everyone is narrating their journey, performing their growth, and broadcasting their plans to an audience of people who are gathering strategic intelligence, whether they appear to be or not, the man who says nothing and executes everything arrives at a destination no one saw coming and no one had the opportunity to block. Tell me in the comments. Are you someone who announces what you are going to do, or someone who lets results do the speaking? Be honest. Because the answer reveals more about your current trajectory than most men are comfortable admitting. The fourth principle is the one Machiavelli returned to with the greatest frequency across his writing, and the one that modern neuroscience has traced to the most precise and uncomfortable biological mechanism: the inability to govern desire. He observed across every political history he studied that men were not conquered most thoroughly by external forces. They were conquered by their own unregulated appetites for validation, for comfort, for immediate gratification at the direct expense of the long-term mission. And he identified this not as a character weakness unique to flawed individuals, but as a structural vulnerability built into human nature itself. One that the strategically aware man would account for deliberately and engineer against systematically. Modern neuroscience explains exactly why this pattern is so consistent across history and so reliably predictable in modern men. Dopamine, the neurotransmitter governing motivation, reward anticipation, and the drive to pursue goals, operates on a system heavily and consistently biased toward immediacy. A reward available now produces a significantly stronger neurological signal than an equivalent or even larger reward available in the future. This temporal discounting of future reward is not a rational calculation made by a conscious mind weighing its options. It is a deeply embedded biological bias that evolved in environments where the future was genuinely uncertain, and seizing immediate reward was therefore the rational survival strategy. That logic was correct for early human survival. In a modern environment where strategic patience consistently produces superior long-term outcomes, where the man who holds his position outperforms the man who reacts to every short-term signal. This same bias becomes a systematic engine of self-sabotage, running entirely below the threshold of conscious awareness. You are not choosing comfort over discipline as a free, rational agent, making a clear-eyed decision. You are being pulled toward comfort by neurological circuitry that was never designed for the competitive environment you are actually operating inside. The man who understands this is no longer fighting himself with willpower alone. He is working with an accurate map of his own cognitive architecture, and a man with an accurate map always outperforms a man navigating blind, regardless of how much raw effort the blind man applies. This is what Machiavelli meant by governing appetite, not elimination. Precise, deliberate, strategic governance. Think about the last time you chose something immediately satisfying over something strategically necessary. Think about what that choice actually cost you over the following weeks. Drop that answer in the comments if you are willing to be that honest with yourself. The fifth principle is the one the modern world has made most difficult to apply, and therefore the one that produces the most disproportionate advantage for the men who manage to apply it. Machiavelli observed that the most decisive operations in every political history he studied were the ones that the opposition never saw coming. Not because the executing party was more powerful in the moment of execution, but because they had moved, prepared, and positioned entirely beneath the surface until the moment of execution was already past the point of interception. The hidden movement was not simply a tactical preference, it was a structural advantage that compounded over time. The visible man can always be blocked. The invisible man cannot be blocked because he cannot be located until he has already arrived. Modern psychological research has confirmed this principle from a direction that Machiavelli could not have anticipated. Research conducted across multiple institutions on goal pursuit and social cognition has documented a phenomenon called social reality substitution. When you publicly announce a goal to other people and receive social acknowledgement in response, your brain activates the same reward circuits that genuine achievement would activate. The social recognition is processed by the neurological machinery of accomplishment. The brain, which cannot fully distinguish between the reward of genuine completion and the reward of social acknowledgement for intended completion, registers a version of the goal as partially achieved. The result is a measurable and documented reduction in the internal drive to actually pursue the goal because the reward system has already partially collected on it. Studies show that people who announce intentions publicly are statistically less likely to follow through on them than people who keep those intentions entirely private. The dopamine reward was partially discharged at the announcement stage. Less motivational fuel remains available to power the execution. This means that every time you perform your growth for an audience, every time you announce what you are building, broadcast your daily progress, narrate your transformation for external validation, you are neurologically spending the currency you needed to complete the actual mission. You are trading execution fuel for social acknowledgement, and you are making that trade automatically below the level of conscious awareness, because the dopamine hit of social recognition is immediate, and the cost to your execution momentum is slow and invisible. The man who goes silent and builds is not simply being strategic about information. He is preserving the complete neurological resources that full execution requires. And when he surfaces more developed, more capable, more formidably positioned than anyone who watched the timeline anticipated, the gap between what people assumed and what actually developed is itself a psychological weapon. An unaccountable variable cannot be blocked. It can only be encountered after it has already arrived. The sixth and final principle is the one that connects every other mechanism into a single, coherent psychological architecture, and it is the principle that the entire modern environment is most comprehensively designed to prevent you from developing. The long, strategic timeline. Behavioral economics has documented the cognitive mechanism that makes this so difficult in precise neurological terms. Temporal discounting, the same immediacy bias that governs appetite and impulse. creates a systematic and measurable undervaluation of long-term strategic positioning across virtually all human decision-making contexts. The loudest signal in your environment right now is almost certainly not the most strategically important one. The most strategically important developments in your life, the compound accumulation of sustained discipline over months, the slow construction of expertise that eventually becomes impossible to compete with, the gradual development of strategic advantages that only become visible after years of invisible investment are almost always quiet, slow-moving, and produce no immediate dopamine signal to confirm that the work is worth continuing. There is no notification that fires when compound interest begins to accumulate in your favor. There is no algorithmic reward for maintaining a long-term position under short-term pressure. The system generates no confirmation that you are winning until the winning is already so far advanced that it becomes undeniable from the outside. The urgent signals, the notification, the social comparison, the short-term opportunity demanding immediate reaction are almost always loud, fast-moving, and produce immediate neurological reward for engaging with them, regardless of their actual strategic value. Your brain wants to respond to them. It was built to respond to them, and every competitive environment on Earth generates manufactured urgency, specifically to keep the people inside it reactive, distracted, and therefore manageable. Machiavelli studied the rulers who lasted the ones who built power that compounded across decades rather than collapsing under the weight of early reactive decisions, and identified the deliberate marriage of strategy and patience as the single most consistent differentiating factor between the men who endured and the men who fell. Not brilliance, not resources, not superior aggression. The willingness to hold a long-term position under sustained short-term pressure without being diverted by the secondary noise that systematically eliminated every other competitor before the compound effects became visible to anyone watching. The leader who could not wait was always eventually outmaneuvered by the leader who could. That principle has not changed. It has only become more valuable as the pressure to react immediately has intensified around every man alive today. So here is the final question. The one I want you to answer in the comments because it will tell you and every other man reading it exactly where you currently stand inside this framework. Which of these 6 principles, the neurological default toward reactive distraction, the invisible ceiling of your social environment, the strategic cost of information leakage, the governance of immediate appetite, the discipline of invisible movement, or the compound power of the long timeline, which one are you failing at most consistently in your actual daily behavior? Not in theory, not in how you think about yourself, in what you actually do when no one is watching and the easier option is right in front of you. Name it precisely in the comments. Because the man who can identify exactly where his power is currently leaking is already operating at a level of self-awareness that most men will spend their entire lives successfully avoiding. And Machiavelli, who spent his life studying the precise gap between what men are capable of and what they actually produce, understood that the first step toward closing that gap was always the same, seeing the mechanism clearly enough to name it without flinching. This is the complete psychological architecture of the dangerous mind, not a mood, not a mindset in the vague, comfortable, socially acceptable sense of that word. A specific, documented, neurologically grounded set of cognitive disciplines that operate directly against every default. Your environment is continuously trying to install in you, without your awareness, without your consent, and with remarkable consistency across every man who has not taken the time to understand the machinery well enough to override it deliberately. The governed response that compounds while reactive men burn their resources on every provocation. The curated environment that elevates thinking while unexamined environments quietly install their limitations and call them personality. The strategic silence that executes with full power while the announced man watches his disclosed plans get intercepted and countered before he has even begun. The disciplined appetite that redirects immediate reward signals toward long-term compound investment, while the undisciplined man trades future outcomes for present comfort at a rate he never stops to calculate. The invisible movement that arrives with complete psychological resources intact, while the visible man has already spent half his motivational fuel on the applause of the announcement. And the long timeline that wins the only game worth playing, the one where consistency, compounding, and the refusal to be diverted from primary objectives produces results that short-term players will attribute to talent, luck, or circumstance, because they cannot see the years of invisible work that actually produced them. Machiavelli did not write his principles for men who wanted to feel inspired. He wrote them for men who wanted to understand the machinery of power precisely enough to operate it deliberately. He wrote for the man willing to see his own neurological defaults without the protection of flattering self-narrative. The man willing to look at his environment with the same cold, unsentimental clarity that a strategist applies to any other variable that is affecting his outcomes. The man willing to govern his own impulses not because some content told him discipline was important, but because he now understands the exact biological mechanism by which ungoverned impulse dismantles everything an ungoverned man builds. That man is rare. He has always been rare, and his rarity is precisely what makes the principles Machiavelli spent his life documenting so enduringly, so disproportionately powerful for the few who apply them against the many who never will. The system is already running inside you and around you right now. The only question that has ever actually mattered, the one that separates every man who eventually produces something undeniable from every man who spends his life explaining why he almost did, is whether you are running the system or the system is running you. If this gave you something real, if any part of this landed in a place you do not usually let things land, press like and follow dark psychology explanation. Because what comes next goes deeper into the mechanics of power, influence, and the psychology of the men who hold it versus the men who are held by it. The machine does not stop, it never has. The only variable, the only thing that has ever actually been in your control is your level of understanding of precisely how it works.